Hello and welcome to this special episode of the NextGen Planners Examarama podcast. And in this episode, we're going to explore all things AF4. So John, AF4, a lot of people will usually look at AF4 maybe as their first of the advanced exams. Oftentimes it's considered to be maybe a little less technical than AF1 and maybe fewer calculations, but actually you can be lured into a very false sense of security with this one, can't you? Because it's a very big syllabus and you're still going to have to learn a lot of equations and calculations.
Sorry to go straight in there with the bad news for everyone, but I don't think this is the easiest of the AF exams. I really don't. You can pass it and you can pass it well, but you're going to have to put the work in. There's no shortcuts with this one, I'm afraid.
Absolutely. Well, we started off on a happy note then, haven't we? But in this session, what we're going to do is we're going to take our audience through an awful lot more stuff around the structure of the exam, aren't we? How to decode AF4. And then at the end, we'll talk about a little more about the support that you can get from NextGen Planners. So, John, where would we start when we're thinking about decoding this exam?
So the first thing you've got to do before you do anything else in this exam is make sure you understand what the exam involves. Now, it sounds stupidly obvious, and it is. You know the exam involves investment, but there's a lot more that lies behind that. So ask yourself, how well do I really know what is involved in this exam? What's going to be expected of me? What will good look like? What's the examiner going to be throwing at me? It's quite easy to just pitch straight into study. And I've been guilty of it myself in the past. Pitch straight into study and think, I need to make sure I know everything about investments before I take the exam. But that's kind of step 3 in the process. Before you get to that, there's 2 important steps that you should take. And those are the ones that I'm going to walk you through first of all. So the first point is just understand the nature of the exam. What is it that's going to be expected of me? And the starting point there is your syllabus. Okay, excuse me. The syllabus should be super familiar to everyone that's taking this exam, but often we don't. We just kind of ignore it. We dive in at the deep end. But you can see there's an awful lot involved in this exam. So, number 1, economic environment and its impact on investment performance and investment decision making. Now, that is an area that doesn't get answered very well. Repeatedly, the examiner calls it out as something that students don't do very well. You're going to need to know quite a lot about economics for this exam, macroeconomic theory. And it's not something that you touch on a great deal at the RO level. As vast as the RO2 syllabus is, it really doesn't cover a great deal of that macroeconomic stuff. There's the one chapter, the one element, but it's not the kind of depth that you'd want for this exam. So there's a key area to be picking up on. You've got features, risks, and returns of direct financial investments, and features, risks, and returns of collective investment products. So in other words, the features, risks, and returns of all investments. And here's where we get to a bit of a problem. There's a lot of investments, there's a lot of direct investments, there's a lot of indirect investments. And unlike with a lot of the exams where you can question spot quite easily, and you can say, well, the examiner loves this. If I'm looking at AF1, the examiner loves an income tax calculation. I can feel fairly certain I'm going to get some kind of income tax calculation. In this exam, you don't find that. What you find is that the examiner will ask you more questions in this exam, and they'll ask those questions across a broader spectrum of different elements. So you tend to get more questions in this exam for fewer marks per question. And that means you need to have a real breadth of knowledge. As if that weren't bad enough, the other thing the examiner will tend to do is quite pick on a particular investment for each exam and do a bit of a deep dive on that. So it might be that one time they're picking on VCTs and EISs and they're doing a deep dive and you have 4 or 5 questions for 5 or 6 marks on just that one particular investment. You think, well, okay, I've seen that's been in a past exam. I'm going to learn all about that. And the next time you go into one, it's about REITs instead. And you can't question spot. So you need to have quite a deep knowledge, but quite a broad knowledge. And that means quite a lot of work. And that's why I said at the start, it's not one to underestimate. You are going to need to really put the work in. But if you do that, and if you build yourself a structured study plan that says, well, I need to know all these different investments, I need to know a reasonable amount about them, I want to know about the features, risks, and returns of each one of them, then you can build up that knowledge quite nicely. And there shouldn't be anything they can throw at you that you're not going to be comfortable with. Number 4 is one you won't necessarily have touched on before. So you're looking there at the feature, the individual company performance and company accounts. So you're going to get asked questions about company accounts, and you're going to need to know how to look at a basic set of company accounts and interpret what it is that you're seeing in there. It's quite a big ask that if you've not done that before. So we'll look in a second at how you find that information. Then we've got types of measurement of risk and returns. So that all the different measurements, they come up quite a lot. So how are you measuring the time-weighted return, money-weighted return? Now, at the RO3 level, those kind of questions came in the multiple response area. And very often what that means is you can be pretty much guaranteed there's going to be no calculation question there. So you can just learn about the principle of time-weighted return and money-weighted return, because it's hard to ask a calculation question in multiple response. Jump forward to this exam, you are going to want to know how to calculate those, because they could quite easily throw a calculation question in for you. Principles governing how to construct an investment portfolio. So you're going to be looking there at the different investment styles, investment theories, management styles, all those different things, top up, bottom down. How comfortable are you with those? Your asset allocation, your benchmarking, lots of content there. A lot of that is in the RO2 level, but there's stuff that you can build on. And then finally, the range of portfolio management services, not something that you would have touched on at all really at the RO2 level. So I'll come back to where you'll find that information in a second, but let's just think about what the exam breaks down as. Like all these AF exams, you've got 160 marks up for grabs. Okay, so 80 in the first section, 40 and then 40 in sections B and C. 3 hours, if you're not used to sitting and typing for 3 hours or writing for 3 hours, you got to think about that, because it's a long old stint to be going. All these exams are they're big chunks. My kids have just done their GCSEs, and back in the day when I did mine, we had quite a lot of 2.5, 3 hour exams. Now they've broken them all down. You don't get any that are longer than an hour and a half. This is a 3 hour exam. It's a big old length of time to be sat taking an exam. You've got to prepare yourself mentally for that. You've got to get 55% to pass, which is quite a doable score. And actually, the good news is that more than half of people that took this exam in 2023 passed it, 53.3%. Okay, now you think, okay, that's 1 in 2 passed it. That means 1 in 2 missed out. But the better prepared candidates got through this. Okay, and you can be one of those better prepared candidates. So if you put the work in, it's very passable, but you do have to get that work nailed in the first place. One thing I would emphasize as you're going through your study is this isn't level 4 anymore. So whereas at level 4, the emphasis was on learning, here it's on learning and application. So do you understand something? Do you remember it? But also, can you relate it back to the case study that you've been given? And that requires you to learn it at a different level. So as you're going through your study, you're refreshing your knowledge of the RO2 stuff that you learned before. You've got to think about it in a more conceptual way. So could I apply this to a case study? And there's things you can do to help yourself along the line with that, as I'll show you in a second. So where am I going to find all this knowledge? I've said that RO2 is not enough. What else have you got? Well, J10 is your other assumed learning for this exam. Hands up how many of you have taken J10? Yeah, I didn't think so. Not many people. It's not one of the exams that most people take, but there's a lot of content in this exam that will require you to know J10. Okay, so how do I go about doing that? If you're a CII member, you may or may not be aware of this, but they make available to you all of their textbooks, all of their study guides as PDFs for free download. Okay, so you can go onto the CII website. You can, if you're a member, you can log on and you can actually access the study guide for J10. Get a PDF of that, and then you can use that to infill your knowledge, the nuts and bolts, the things that you won't have come across in your day job. So, for example, you're going to need to know about earnings per share and dividend yield and dividend cover and all those kind of things you wouldn't necessarily touch on in most day jobs. But for this exam, you are going to need to know them. And you'll find a lot of that content in the J10 textbook there. Don't underestimate calculations. There are quite a lot of calculations in this exam. Most of them, though, and this is the good news, things like earnings per share and that kind of stuff, they are easy to do if you know how. Okay, so don't panic, don't worry. The calculations are there, but they are all very doable. You just need to learn the mechanism as to how to do it. So setting aside some time to do that, it's really going to pay dividends, if you'll pardon the pun, a little bit later on. Okay, so RO2 and J10, you're not going to get through the exam just with the RO2 content. One final thing before I move on. When you are looking at the RO2 content, whereas when you're taking RO2, you would have concentrated on the big rocks and the areas that come up most often. With the AF exam, you want to be making sure that the bits that you glossed over before and that you really didn't bother paying much attention to, now's the time to dive in and make sure that you understand those. So build on what you had before, infill with extra details. Okay, so use that RO2 text to just fill in the bits that you perhaps didn't look at last time around. Okay, so all very helpful, John, but where the hell do I start? Good question, fair one. We've already said you're going to look at the syllabus. Okay, you've got the 2 textbooks to look at there, but what's the first thing you should do after that? Well, my view of this is the first thing that you should be looking at is making sure that you understand what the examiner is going to expect of you. Okay, it's the old thing that you can't hit what you can't see. If you're trying to take a penalty and you can't see the goal in front of you, you're not likely to score. Okay, so it's about understanding what the examiner wants from you. If you don't know what the examiner wants, you can't give it to them. In a multiple choice exam, it's dead simple. They want you to find the right answer from the 4 options they've given you. In a written exam, it's not that straightforward. Okay, so where are you going to find all that information? You're going to find it in the examiner's guides. So I said there were 2 things I wanted you to do. The first one was look at the syllabus, make sure you're comfortable with what the exam consists of. The second one is get your hands on as many examiner guides as you can possibly manage to find. Okay? Get hold of them, use them as your starting point, but don't do what most people do. So I'll tell you what most people do. They get hold of an exam guide, they look at the questions, flick forward to the model answer, go, okay, I understand that, or perhaps I wouldn't have answered it that way. And actually on that point, it is worth saying the model answer they put in those exam guides is a model answer. It does actually say at the top, this is one way that you would have got full marks, but you can actually get full marks by doing it slightly differently. So don't panic if you would have answered it slightly differently. Okay, but they look at the questions, look at the model answer, and then they move on. That misses the most important piece. And the most important piece is the examiner's commentary. At the front of the exam paper, you have got the examiner's commentary, and it says, this is the way we like you to structure your answers. And in this particular exam, these are the questions they answered really well, the candidates answered really well. This is what we really like. This is what we didn't like. And then it goes through each individual question and says, we like what students did here, or we really don't like this. This was answered really badly. And very often where it's answered really badly, they'll then go on to say, so we're going to ask it again. Okay. And they will keep coming back to areas that students answer badly. So that's great to know. In an exam that I said is hard to question spot for, if the examiner is saying to you, we're going to keep examining this until you get it right, brilliant. That's an area that I know I need to revise. Okay, so in a second, we're going to take a quick break. And then when we come back from the break, I'm going to just walk through some examples of some of the examiner commentary from recent exam papers, just so you can see what I mean. And you can see that I'm not telling fibs, but that'll point you back towards those exam guides. Okay, so at this point, let's take a quick intermission and then we'll have a look at some of that commentary.
So we're back, and John, just before the break, you said we were going to look at some examiners' commentary. Surprising that fewer candidates, or at least relatively few candidates, look at this before they start diving into textbooks, because it's very tempting to think, oh, this is the thing that I need to do. I need to start studying, but you can very easily be diverted into studying the wrong thing and taking too much time over it as well. And looking at what the examiner's feedback is can really help that, can't it? And particularly, one of the things that we're dead keen on here at NextGen Planners is to study less and pass more. So actually take the time when you're studying, looking at the right things. So this is one of the best places to start, isn't it?
Absolutely. I always liken it to running. If you want to get faster as a runner, just going out and running longer miles at the same pace is not going to get you there. You have to do that kind of interval work. You have to run smart, not just hard. And you can really study smart with this exam by starting off by looking at those examiners' commentaries. So please, when you're getting those exam guides, don't just gloss over that examiner commentary. Really deep dive into it and look at what works really well and what doesn't work really well. So let me give you some examples of it. You can see some on the slide there. So in questions relating to investment risk and behavioral finance, the regurgitation of model answers from previous exam guides, for example, the same long list of investment risks or behaviors, it's important that candidates read the question being asked carefully and ensure their answer is aligned. Now, that is a really important point, okay? I'm pointing you towards these exam guides, but please do not just build yourself up a list of model answers and say, right, whatever they ask me, that's what they're going to get. Remember, I said at this level, it's about your ability to apply your knowledge, and you've got to be able to look at the contemporary information that's given to you and apply your knowledge to that case study. So if a previous model answer related to somebody completely different circumstances, you're not going to get full marks for using that same answer, but you might get marks for using the same sort of format and adapting your knowledge to that particular case study. Okay. It was pleasing to see fewer candidates writing expansive narrative style answers, usually written in the belief that the more they wrote, the more marks would be awarded, in favour of more candidates answering with a succinct bullet point style. Right. Important. Practice writing in bullet points. Examiners do not want to have to read War and Peace. Imagine you're an examiner. You've been sent a whole raft of AF4 scripts to read and mark. You've got a marking schedule that says this is worth a mark, this is worth a mark, this is worth a mark. You've got to read through 3 pages of rambling narrative to try and find those 3 marks. It's hard work, and they're not going to love you for it. When you're writing, make each bullet point a challenge to the examiner. I think this is worth a mark. You tell me it isn't. Okay. So as you're studying, get used to bullet points. Get used to it early doors, and you'll find it easier in the exam. Candidates who did not perform well generally provided superficial answers that meant that they weren't able to be awarded a small number of the available marks, often identifying marks equivalent to RQF level 3 or 4, but not that more detailed level of knowledge required at level 6. There's some important stuff to call out there. In the past exam guides, they've even pointed students towards things like the Debt Management Office website and said there's a load of information on there. We would expect students at this level to have gone to those sort of resources and got that greater depth of information. Okay, so do make use of some of those broader resources. There's a lot of stuff that you can get from NextGen, but you can also use things like the Government's Debt Management Office, the Bank of England, fill in all that information as well. So lots of different sources. Candidates who did not perform well either used the incorrect formula or didn't show all the stages of their calculation, which relates to the bottom part. To gain maximum marks for calculations, you must show all your workings and express your answer to 2 decimal places. So if you hadn't read that exam commentary, would you even have known that answers should be to 2 decimal places? Probably not. Now you know it. So give your answer to 2 decimal places and show every step of your working. As you're going through, very often you'll get a mark or 2 marks for the final answer. All the rest of the marks come for the steps that were there before. Equally, if you've got all those steps right, and then for whatever reason, you have a little bit of a mind blow and you write the wrong thing down at the end for the final answer, you can still pick up most of those marks. Okay, so show all your workings. Candidate performance in this sitting benefited from improved exam technique from the majority of candidates. That manifested itself in candidates demonstrating a tighter application of the action verb in the question part. So important. Get used to the action verbs. When you're looking through those exam guides and you're thinking about your study, look at the way that they ask the questions. If they're asking you to state something, they want you to state it. If they're asking you to explain it, they want you to explain it. But the model answers will show you what that means. Okay, then you can get used to writing answers in that style. At level 6, it's reasonable to expect candidates to know not just the factor, for example, interest rates, but directionality. So, for example, increasing. So they would expect you to know not just that there is a relationship between the price of a bond and interest rates, but there is an inverse relationship in that as interest rates rise, the price of a bond will fall, and why. Okay, little simple supply and demand diagram drawn on your rough paper can help you. No end there. It was evident some candidates repeated model answers, same point again, right, from similar questions in previous papers, often on a verbatim basis. Don't do that. And then finally, several candidates stated ways in which sequencing risk can be mitigated, despite this being a separate question part in question 2. I've thrown that one in there just to emphasize a point that a lot of students do quite often. They don't read all of the question before they start answering. Okay, so it's kind of like diving straight into your study without looking at the syllabus. Don't dive straight into answering a question on exam day without looking at what question comes next, because otherwise you end up writing the same thing twice. Okay, so some useful little pointers there. Let's pull that together. My health warning to you, okay? It's not an easy exam to question spot. And I know I've said that already. There is a wide variety of different content they're going to throw things at you. And there does tend to be that different focus each time where they'll do a little bit of a deep dive. You're going to need deep knowledge and you're going to need broad knowledge. But don't panic, okay? Because there is some commonality. One of the things that I do, because I am an uber geek, is I get all the exam papers and I go through them all and I look at where the marks were. So, looking at equities, explaining the price earnings ratio and the price earnings growth ratio. Well, there was 8 marks given for that once, there was 4 marks given for that another time. Okay, that's useful for me to know. But what do I do with that? Well, I put it into a little summary table for you, because I find this quite a useful way to focus my mind for study for this exam. Whilst there is a lot of information that it's hard to question spot, what I can do is to focus my study in those themes. So on average, I know that there's likely to be around 30 odd marks available on bonds and equities. Okay, I'm going to need to know about those. Likewise, property collectives and other investments is worth another 26-ish on average. So you're looking at about 60 marks out of 160 on those investment types. Now, if all I've done is just learned about those investments, I'm going to fail this exam. I might get 60 marks, but I'm going to miss out on all the others. Because what I also need is to be able to understand company accounts and market factors. There's 21 marks there. There's a lot of stuff involved in that. So that would include looking at being able to analyze some basic company accounts. It would also throw in some of that macroeconomics that I talked about earlier on. So if I don't understand that stuff, there's 20 marks going begging. 32 marks on average on portfolio construction. Now, all these numbers, I will say, don't hold me to them. It's not gospel. This is just my experience based on analysis of lots of different past papers and average of what's come up. But 32 marks on portfolio construction says I'm going to want to understand portfolio construction and a lot of that J10 content if I'm going to want to feel comfortable going into this exam. Portfolio analysis, another 28 marks on average. And then at the bottom there, miscellaneous, 18. One thing that I've found a lot in this exam is they just throw in anything, right? Each exam, there'll be maybe a few questions, a question or two on pensions. You might get a question on ISAs. It could be on regulation. It's like they kind of gather up things from all over the place and they'll just throw in a particular question here or there. So that miscellaneous element is something you might touch lucky on, you might not touch lucky on. What you need to make sure is you're picking up all the marks that came before that so that you're not reliant on those miscellaneous marks at the end. From a portfolio analysis perspective, I should have said, what sort of things are you looking at there? Well, you're looking at things like information ratio, Sharpe ratio, the alpha, beta, kappa, all those different things that students love so very much, or perhaps not. Okay, so where's that leave us? Where do we get to? Well, first thing I think you should do, review the syllabus, okay? Secondly, access all the exam guides you can get your hands on, as many as you can find. Keep one of them back, ideally the most recent one, for later use. Okay, and the good thing about the exam guides for this exam, investments don't tend to change very much. So a lot of the past content won't be out of date either, which is great. So even exams from 10 years ago are still pretty relevant. Keep one back and use that as a mock just before you get to the exam. Okay, but for all the others, go through, look at the questions, look at the model answer, and look at the examiner's commentary. Compile yourself a style guide. What did they love? What did they hate? What was the way that they answered questions? What are the action verbs that they use time and time again? And that will form the basis of your study going forward. Quick whistle stop tour from me there. I've covered quite a lot of ground. I think that's me kind of tapping out at this point. So Adam, why don't you come back in and tell everybody about the support they can get from NextGen?
Absolutely, John, and thank you for that, and covered it in great depth there, so that's really helpful. And of course, we have much more at NextGen Planners for you. So if you're planning to study AF4, what do we have? Well, our AF4 content forms part of our famous training contract, and we've put hundreds of people through the advanced qualifications through this process. So you'll be able to access weekly group tutorials of up to 90 minutes covering all of the syllabus. And there'll be 2 days of virtual classroom ahead of the exam where we go through the syllabus again. The purpose for that is that we want you to be prepared for the virtual classroom. A lot of people say to us, why do you do months of weekly group tutorials ahead of the 2 days? Why not just the 2 days? But oftentimes, knowing the content before you get into those 2 days means that those 2 days are revision of that content and just embedding that learning and preparation for the exam. But on top of that, you can get in touch with us for a tutorial during the process, and we'll do one-to-one tutorials on all those gnarly subjects that you're finding a little difficult. And then, of course, there is our award-winning on-demand video content that you'll be able to access at any point to suit you, either on a mobile device or on your laptop. So plenty to be going at, John, and it's a program that you're involved with, and they're just great groups, aren't they?
They really are. I think what you've hit the nail on the head, Drew. What I really like about the 2-day tutorials, and those are the ones that I'm kind of most involved in the past, is that because you've had all that prior learning, people come along to that with some great questions. They want to really deep dive into things, and they're like, yeah, but how does this work and how does that work? And every now and then, I've been doing this for 28 years now, but every now and then someone will say, do you know you're wrong on that, John? I go, hang on a minute, what? And actually, the level of learning that some of these people have picked up, I go, actually, do you know what? You're right, I am. And then we have a whole discussion around it. Honestly, they're great groups.
Fantastic stuff. So if you'd like to learn more, then get in touch with us at contact@nextgenplanners.co.uk, or you can find us on the NextGen Planners website. John, thanks again for joining me. It was really informative, and we will look forward to seeing everybody very soon.